Hello and welcome to another video from the only YouTube channel that you need to not only survive the current apocalypse but actually enjoy it. And today's video is going to be another one of my series, What's This Bible All About? And this is going to be part 2. God creates an anti-civilization. I highly recommend that you watch part 1 before watching this video if you haven't already done so. In part 1, we talked about how in the beginning, God only gave mankind one law. And that law was for mankind to spread out and cover the entire earth and care for all of God's creation with no specific instructions added other than not to eat from one special tree. Few people chose to be obedient to this law, but the Bible says that those who were got to be personal friends of the Creator. Most refused to obey this law and then chose instead to build civilizations, complete with population centers, standing armies, economic systems, agricultural systems, religious systems, and political systems, and so on and so forth. Rather than benefiting the earth, all of these systems actually harm the earth. And because of the destructive nature of these systems, God has set a pattern of destroying one civilization after another using such things as flood, confusion of the language, and even fire from the sky. And yet human beings continue to build empires with no regard for the planet or the Creator. One man who did follow God's law was Abraham. Although always in close proximity to human civilizations, for 234 years his family had always managed to limit their contact with them. But that was all about to change. Since the time of Babel, the original hole punched through the canopy of the forest had grown. In fact, as humans would establish other empires, they would each punch their own hole through the canopy, and as the holes grew, they started to connect. The natural systems of the earth that had successfully fed and sheltered the human family so well for so many thousands of years were being replaced by empires, complete with unsustainable, unnatural, destructive agricultural practices. An area which had been a rainforest just a few hundred years earlier was now almost totally devoid of trees. The desertification of the earth was now in full swing. Mankind in general was not following God's first law and not fulfilling the purpose for which he had been created. Every nation in that part of the world was quickly losing its ability to sustain itself. However, Egypt was different because the Nile River brought down water from Central Africa hundreds of miles away. And because of this, Egypt was the only civilization able to actually produce a surplus, even as the nations surrounding them collapsed. And when Pharaoh had a prophetic dream, the Creator would not reveal what it meant to him or any other member of Egypt's civilization. The only man in the entire kingdom with direct access to the Creator was a nomadic man who had been enslaved and imprisoned by the empire for 11 years. His name was Joseph. And God revealed to him that there was going to be a great famine just in time for Pharaoh to put away enough grains to save the refugees from all of the surrounding civilizations as well as the wandering indigenous descendants of Abraham. This series of historic events brought about two things. First off, the huge influx of people from the surrounding cities made Egypt become what the Bible calls the first world empire, what we today would call a superpower. This would play heavily into many Bible prophecies concerning all future world empires, including the empire that we live under today. And second, instead of just telling Israel that civilizations were bad, it allowed the people whom God was about to use to see for themselves firsthand just how truly evil human civilizations were. They went from being able to acquire all of the necessities of life with very little effort to having to work long, hard hours away from their families just so they might have their basic needs met. After years of this miserable existence, Israel was about to be led out of Egypt by a member of the royal family named Moses. Even though he could have lived out his life as an elitist member of the royal family, Moses knew that Egypt's primary goal was to break God's law. And so he chose instead to walk away from Egyptian civilization and live as a nomadic sheep herder in Midian. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 25 says, Moses chose to be ill-treated rather than have the temporary enjoyment of sin. And because of this, God spoke to Moses and revealed something about himself that is very important to our discussion. When Moses asked God, "What is your name?" God said, "I am creator." He did not say it in such a way as to imply that he was a creator on days when he wasn't busy with other things. He wanted Moses to understand that this was not his title. It is who he was. The literal translation of this statement would be, "I am to become," which we can understand to mean, "I am causes to become." Basically, he was telling Moses, everything that exists comes from me, so in effect, anything that is done to my creation is being done directly to me personally. In modern Hebrew, the name of God, literally "to become," is pronounced Yahweh. But we today cannot have any idea how that name sounded thousands of years ago when Abraham heard it in his own native tongue. But we can know that Moses had a new understanding of just how evil the planet-destroying infrastructure of human civilizations was. He could now confirm what he already knew in his heart, that civilization's unsustainable attacks against the earth were direct attacks against his God. After 40 years in Midian, Moses returned to Egypt, once again to be used by Yahweh to lead the slave labor force of Egypt to the land that had been promised to Abraham so many centuries earlier. Moses did not just walk into Egypt and tell his people, "Let's go." There was a lot more involved. He had to go before Pharaoh, the most powerful man on earth at that time. It wasn't easy. Empires then were not much different than our Anglo-American empire now. The middle class as well as the ruling class could completely disappear without causing too many problems, because people in general can live without bullies and enforcers for a time. But without food, water, and sanitation, things get really bad really quick. So when the slave leaves, everything collapses. The religious system, the economic system, social system, agricultural system, political system, etc., etc., etc. Basically, the entire infrastructure of the civilization. Pharaoh knew this and was not willing to let Israel leave. Yahweh's solution to this dilemma was beautiful in its simplicity. He just went ahead and destroyed all of them systems before Moses even took his people. And this he did by way of 10 plagues. Egypt never recovered from this blow, and in time completely collapsed, just like all of the lesser civilizations that came before it, causing Assyria to eventually replace Egypt as the dominant world superpower. There could be no mistake about it. The Israelites knew that they were being miraculously delivered out of Egypt directly by their God Yahweh. They were aware of God's first law. They also would have known that Egypt was crushed because of its defiance of that law. But human beings are always trying to find ways to circumvent the law, so each time that God destroys one civilization, he re-explains the first law and makes other laws just so that people get an understanding of what the first law means. And now it's time to give his people a law code unlike any that had ever been instituted before in human history. The law code that Yahweh gave to Israel was based on the original law given to Adam. And at this time, Yahweh was expanding on their understanding of that original law by giving them 10 individual laws known as the 10 Words, what we today would call the 10 Commandments. But knowing that humans are always looking for loopholes, he added 603 very specific regulations to cover a multitude of things having to do with everyday life based on God's original law, as well as the principles in the 10 Commandments. There would be no manipulating of the law by legal representatives, as is so popular in the lawyer-driven societies that have dominated human beings throughout history. And every law in the code was written in such a way as to benefit not only the people who were under it, but the land as well. By following this law, the nation would never become a desert wasteland like the surrounding nations. There could never be a state-sponsored agricultural system, political system, economic system, or anything even remotely resembling any of the surrounding society's infrastructure systems. Today, some of these laws would seem arbitrary, But something that people fail to understand is that the law code was only meant to be followed by this small group of people while they're living on this tiny piece of land, and only for the relatively short period of time that they would exist as a nation. Some of these seemingly arbitrary laws had to do with what would have been edible and not edible, or as the Bible puts it, clean or unclean. If a neighboring empire used a food as some kind of special treat, Yahweh may have chosen to make that particular plant or animal product unclean by law. If a food item would not have belonged in that particular ecosystem, Yahweh, as the creator, may have made it unclean by law. Remember that when God's creative week ended and he entered into his day of rest, he looked around and saw that everything was good. Everything that he made was good, and where he put it was good. As a creator, he would have known what plants and animals would benefit this particular region and which might cause damage. Think about it. Would the creator of the earth just arbitrarily decide that some part of his creation was too flawed to be used as food? Of course not. Had Israel been in some other area surrounded by different nations with different ways of doing things, then the law would have been different as well. This law was written in order that everyone on the earth could easily recognize that this group of people was exactly the opposite of every other nation that they would have contact with. And that is why I call the ancient nation of Israel an anti-civilization. Now, after the people of Israel agreed to this radical new law code, Moses ascended Mount Sinai with 2 stone tablets so that Yahweh could carve out his law with his own finger. But before he could even return, some of the people decided that they wanted to have a religious festival just like the religious festivals that they used to take part in back in the empire. Initially, most would not go along with this because they knew that their new law prohibited every aspect of state-sponsored religion. But those ringleaders had 40 days to pressure the people by telling them that the idol that they would make would not be for one of the gods of the surrounding land, but to Yahweh himself. Never mind, it was shaped just like a golden calf that represented Baal. And the music that they would sing, although the same as the religious music of Egypt, would actually be sung for Yahweh himself as well. As it turned out, this line of reasoning only took 40 days to convince the last stragglers. It seemed that there were some who really didn't want to leave civilization behind, but only wanted to leave Egypt behind and take civilization with them. This was just the first of civilization systems that wicked Israelites would try to reestablish, and the consequences were quick and decisive. Thousands of the wrongdoers were slaughtered right then and there, so that everyone could see it. This was very important, and I'm going to explain why right now. In all civilizations, then and now, there is always some kind of a benevolent law code. But just like in our modern societies, the written law never means anything. I live in the U.S. Instead of the 10 Commandments, like many other countries, we have a Constitution. And I can tell you from nearly 50 years alive in this country, as well as countless hours studying history, that not one single precept of the U.S. Constitution has ever been followed by this country in any way. So how happy those people must have been who had been pressured into compliance. Think about it. Their God was going to make sure personally that this wonderful, benevolent, written law code was actually going to be followed. This was not a situation that had ever existed before, nor has it existed since. If you don't believe me, exert whatever rights your nation promises, and I can guarantee that you will discover that the only time that the powers that be concern themselves with your rights is when there is some kind of insanely exorbitant profit in it for the lawyers and judges involved. What in my nation is called a civil justice system would be more accurately described as justice to the highest bidder. And I can guarantee you that no matter what country you call home, it is exactly the same for you. Think about it. No matter where you live, wouldn't it be satisfying if you could go to sleep at night knowing that all of the promises found in your nation's law code were going to be kept? In my country, the U.S., quite literally, millions have chosen to risk their lives and even go to their deaths if necessary in order to defend the U.S. Constitution, knowing that they would forfeit their own rights when they forfeited their lives. But they were more than willing to do so just so that the rest of us could enjoy these rights. Sadly, not only did they not get to enjoy these rights themselves, but those of us who they died for have never been able to enjoy those rights either. And the truly tragic thing is those that they were fighting also died. And guess what? They died for the same reason, just trying to defend their own benevolent law code that was never going to even be honored anyway. All right, well, from this point on, whether or not the law of Moses was going to be honored would never again be an issue. All right, the Israelites would spend the next 40 years wandering in that man-made desert. They were going to learn firsthand while they were there not to fear the civilizations that created such a vast stretch of wasteland, simply because during their time there they would actually thrive. Never mind that there were no natural resources available to sustain human life, their God was powerful enough to sustain them under any conditions. Plus, the time that they would spend there would shape them into a nation that Yahweh could use. He didn't want his people to go into the last little piece of healthy ground in the area and just destroy it the same way that all the other civilizations in the area had destroyed their little pieces of ground. This time in the desert would allow for the training of those who would actually enter the promised land, as well as allowing enough time for all of those who were still craving civilization to die off. Both of these points are made abundantly clear in the Bible. As bad people attempted to bring back each and every one of civilization's other infrastructure systems, they were quickly crushed for all to see, just as those who had tried to bring back the old state-sponsored religious system were crushed. This made learning the law really easy. But once God was finished shaping this people into an anti-civilization, what was he going to do with them? Why would Yahweh create such an unusual nation? A nation with no monetary system, no political system, no agricultural system, and no standing military. A nation that was exactly the opposite of every nation that had ever existed, not to mention every nation that was going to exist. How could he use this tiny group of nomadic, indigenous peoples, especially since they were surrounded by human civilizations? A point that you may notice coming up over and over again in this series, and I hope that you're able to grasp, is that all empires have one universal standing policy that never changes. And here it is. Whenever an indigenous people like that ancient nation of Israel is found, people living off of the land outside of civilization, people who refuse to participate in the banking system or involve themselves in wage slavery, people who continue to use sustainable food production systems. When any people like this are found, they are to be incarcerated, assimilated, and exterminated. Remember those three. This has always been the standard operating procedure of every world empire that has ever existed, including this one. Israel's following of God's law to care for creation while surrounded by human civilizations whose sole objective was to break that law by harming creation, made the nation of Israel the military target of every human society in that vicinity. Without any of the infrastructure that these societies had, it would make Moses' people look like easy pickings. What would they do? Better yet, what would their God do? In the next video of this series, we're going to just discuss exactly that in What's This Bible All About? Yahweh makes his first law known to all. Don't want to survive? Don't listen to me.